Today I'm going to talk about Indian origin myths and the background to these origin myths. So the earliest wisdom texts of India are the Veda. The Veda, which I'm using in its singular sense, often in English people use the term Vedas because there are a number of texts involved. But altogether it is called Veda, which literally means knowledge. So these texts are texts that form the what may be called the unauthored origin of Hindu wisdom. We use the term unauthored because the self-reference of the Hindu tradition to this, what one might call canonical bedrock of texts, is one that sees them as unauthored, which is how many traditions look at their origin texts. Unauthored would mean that they are revealed. But this notion of the unauthored in India is a little more complex than just saying that some power on high revealed these texts and that they are exactly what that higher power gave to mankind. The term in Sanskrit for what I'm translating as unauthored is apaurushaya. And we'll come across this term purusha, on which apaurushaya is based. Apaurushaya is not of any purusha, or not done by any purusha. And what it literally means is that it has come to us from a non-human source, a non-anthropic source. Yet it has come through certain human beings. These human beings have a what one might call a quasi-human status, in the sense that they're a little more than ordinary humans. They are seers. They can see things that others can't see. And in Sanskrit, that is called rishis. So these rishis have received in their inner sight and in their inner hearing these terms, which is why this particular body of text is called apurushaya, unauthored. But in saying this, there is also an understanding that the rishis are not people who have just some divine original status, but have grown to become receivers or channels of this kind of text, sometimes through the use of the knowledge of these texts themselves. So the writers of these words or texts are preparing themselves through the teachings of these texts to become receivers of the kind of literature that we get in these texts. In this kind of idea already we see the beginnings of the central theme of Indian wisdom, which is the theme of yoga. Yoga means to come into union with a higher source of knowledge. And how do we do that? That becomes the basic subtext of all Indian wisdom. So we find that the Veda, which is a body of texts with some consistency, are divided themselves into four major types or texts or bodies of texts. They're known as the Rig Veda, the Sam Veda, the Yajur Veda, and the Atharva Veda. Each of these is a set of texts or a set of volumes, one may say. Now, some of these, like the Sam Veda and the Yajur Veda, are largely repetitions of the hymns of the Rig Veda. What makes them different from the Rig Veda is that they belong to a certain kind of oral tradition, in which certain features of the use of these hymns are emphasized. So Yajur Veda is related to Yajus, which is connected with the word Yagya, which means ritual or sacrifice. And so Yajur Veda gives us pointers to the use of these hymns in rituals. Sama is related to song. And we find that, in fact, the word Sama, being an Indo-European term, has a family resemblance to the term song. And so Sama Veda is giving us pointers to how the hymns of the Rig Veda are used in chants, in chanting and singing. The Atharva Veda also has some overlap with the Rig Veda, but also has new material in it. So these texts, if we reduce them, we find that the originary set of texts are the hymns, poems, or songs of the Rig Veda. So Rig Veda, one may say, is the original Veda. Now, again, modern scholarship looks at these in a textual and literary way, and we can find that there is a family resemblance between certain texts or volumes that we can class as belonging together as a kind of an archaeological layer in terms of time and history. So a certain body of texts, say from the second to the fifth volume, etc., would be older. Modern scholarship places these texts at around 1500 BCE. There is some controversy and some contention about this with regard to traditionalists and scholars, but we can follow the general received scholarly idea and say that from around 1500 BCE, we have the beginnings of these early texts. The texts continue over time so that by the time we come to the last volume of the Rig Veda, which is the 10th volume, scholarship has placed it at around 1200 BCE. And it's around the same time that some of the later texts, like the text of the Atharva Veda, are being written. Now, along with the Rig Veda following part of the Vedic corpus are certain other kinds of texts. One is a set of texts called the Brahmanas. Another is a set of texts called the Aranyakas. So the Brahmanas are large explanations of some of these hymns. They contain stories, and they also contain instructions on ritual. They're more closely related to the ritual use of texts. And by the time we find that these texts are becoming more crystallized, we also see that society is getting crystallized, so that these texts are closely connected to the evolution of Vedic society. So we find that there is the notion of the human life that is divided into stages or phases. One starts as a student, as a child, and one is taught these hymns of the Rig Veda and forms of conduct, etc., what is called dharma, which is how does one behave and what are the priorities of existence. And then one enters the householder life, which is the life of the married person and the person who owns property and enjoys social existence. This kind of existence is ritually bound. For every incident or important event of this phase of life, one undertakes rituals of sacrifice known as yagyas. So one can say that the brahmanas are very important to this particular phase of life. At an even more advanced age, say after the age of 50, the idea was that the householder starts uh, distancing themselves from social life and spending time in retreats in the forest or in hermitages in the mountains. And at this time, the body of texts that become important for a deeper understanding of the wisdom that has been ritualized in the Brahmanas and poetized in the Rig Vedas or in the Vedas are given in a slightly more bare form. One might call a barer wisdom form, called texts of the forest. The forest is known as Aranya, and these texts are called Aranyakas, or forest texts. So these forest texts are also developing around 1200 BC, or we may say from 1200 to about 800 BCE. And about 800 BCE, something new is happening, which is that a certain class of text is splitting off from this corpus that we've just identified as that of the Veda, the Brahmanas, and the Aranyakas. And they're taking the kind of wisdom orientation of the Aranyakas and making them into a body of text themselves. These are known as the Upanishads. Upanishad. Upanishad literally means to sit close. And one might think about the social background and the history or evolution of society, as I've pointed out, as leading to this through a certain kind of structure that develops around this time. And this structure is inevitable in the history of human civilization. We find this as a recurrent pattern in many and most places where civilization develops. Now, the structure is one in which there is a collusion between the kingly class and the priestly class. And there is a mutual self-authorization of the two and a domination of the general mass. So that the mass don't have any direct access to truth. They have to go through the priests who do the rituals. Ritual becomes the means of communication with a numinous or transcendental source. And this kind of binding in a society is felt by some to be self-defeating because it takes the wisdom out of general existence. And so one can see how some of the people in this society would feel that to retrieve the wisdom content of these teachings, they would have to go to the extreme or to the periphery of that society and set up hermitages, set up various kinds of schools, wisdom schools, mystery schools, in which the knowledge of the Veda is given in a new way that does not require the mediated access of priests. How can we experience this knowledge directly? So even in its very name, the term Upanishad is referring to this idea of sitting close. Sitting close has two kinds of possibilities or meanings. One is what is called the Gurukula, in other words, the family or house of the Guru. The guru, even the word guru also has a literal meaning. It means heavy. The person who has weight, because the weight of knowledge. And the house of the guru is the hermitage, where the students and the guru form a common habitat. They live together and they learn the students learn from the guru not only through what the guru says, but as the guru lives. So it's an existential learning environment. So that is what the Gurukula is, and sitting close is the mode of exchange in the Gurukula. Upanishad is what is the method of teaching, which is intimate oral communication. Now, sitting close has another meaning, a second meaning, which is sitting close to the truth, finding a kind of language that cuts through to the truth, that is not clothed in symbol, not clothed in mystery, that in a sense is appealing to direct insight. And so this kind of change of language has to do with a transition from a certain type of society, which is a symbolic society, which the symbolism of the Veda are lending themselves to another kind of society, which is a peripheral and a direct society of contact with the truth. So we see this transition taking place. And if we follow the Western chronology, this is happening from 1500 BCE to about 800 BCE. And then we find that the Upanishads themselves continue from about 800 BCE to about 500 BCE, the major Upanishads. And then they continue even after that. One may think of a period till 2nd century BCE. And then they diminish but still continue till about the 4th century CE. And in certain accounts, we may say Upanishads are still being written. So it isn't that they come to an end, they also get assimilated into other bodies of wisdom that arise and start proliferating their knowledge from about the 5th century BCE. So we will see how the Buddha comes in the 5th century BCE and disseminates a knowledge that may be called sort of post-Upanishadic, that is kind of Upanishadic, and that continues to enter into people's minds in a new way. So too you have new philosophies like Sankhya, Yoga, etc. that do that. And then we find from about the 1st century CE, new types of knowledge are appearing which are more theistic in nature. Actually, from around the 2nd century BC, more theistic kinds of new wisdom are appearing. These schools also are related to both the Veda and the Upanishads. So, as one of the themes that has been introduced in this course, we can see how there is a shift or transition from mythos to logos, but again from logos to a new mythos. We saw this even in the case of the West. We saw how an old mythic teaching became a kind of a more bare teaching, or we may even say that they kind of remained in relation to one another. There is a logos within the mythos, and then it emerges as pure logos. And so this happens in Greek wisdom, for example, early Greek Hellenic wisdom. And then we find a return to mythos with Christianity. And then we also find an incorporation of the logos into the mythos with the teachings of the Christology of St. Paul or St. John, etc., as we saw, that some of these Greek logocentric ideas are becoming mythical in the life of Christ. So in a similar way, we find that the poetic speech of the Veda is a kind of a mythos. It's a mythic speech. And then the Upanishads are pulling out, extracting the logos from this mythic speech and trying to present it in a more directly logos-oriented speech, a proto-philosophical speech. And then we find again that by the time we come to the period from the 2nd century BC to the 4th or 5th century CE, there is a return of the mythos in a new way, in bodies of texts that make their final appearance as what are called the Puranas. The Puranas are made into texts around the 4th or 5th century CE, but they're preluded by other texts, and the two most important texts that prelude the Purana but are also of that kind are the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita. So we can see these bodies of texts. We can see the Veda, and then a change into a more logos-oriented text with the Upanishads, and then another change into a quasi-logos myth with the Bhagavatism of Mahabharata and Gita, and then a more mythic speech that comes with the Puranas related to the two great gods, Vishnu and Shiva, and the goddess Devi. Now, coming to origin myths, the Veda itself gives us the early origin myths. But origin myths in the Veda don't come from the very beginning. We find the origin myths of the Veda coming to us in the 10th mandala, or the 10th volume, the last volume of the Veda. And the first of these origin myths has been talked about a lot. It is in some senses a notorious myth. It is the 90th hymn of the 10th mandala, and it has been called the Purusha Sukta. Some scholars feel that this is a much later hymn that has been inserted to authorize what is called the caste system. Because we'll see in this particular hymn how Purusha, the term Purusha is used also for the first time in the Veda. Purusha sacrifices himself into the 4 castes. And the castes are also mentioned for the first time in this particular hymn. But if we are to actually look at the earlier corpus, we can see that this is preparing. This itself is a new languaging of ideas that have been present from the very earliest layer of the Veda. And this early layer of the Veda can also be seen to have relations with other Indo-European texts and mythic structures. So one of the really important features of that is, in terms of culture, the importance of the sun. These are all solar cultures, and the myths are solar myths. The second idea over here is that of a divisioning of the solar power into a quaternary. This also has many different manifestations in different Indo-European civilizations. One may even say that the image of Christ on the cross is an image of the sun come down but splayed against the distribution of the sun in 4 different directions. So these are the 4 directions of the horizontal plane. And in the numerology of the 1 dividing to the 4, or actually forming a system of 5, we find that there is a great resonance across cultures. This numerology is sometimes made a little more complex and made into a numerology of 6 or 7. In other words, you have 1 center with 4 radiations and a direction upwards and downwards. This direction upwards and downwards is a verticality. These ideas are all present in the Veda. in the early Vedas. In the 10th mandala of the Veda, in the 90th hymn, we'll find that these same ideas are repeated with new language. And just to give a certain opening to that language, we can see that the word Purusha, which is used a number of times afterwards and becomes very common in the Indian philosophical tradition after Sankhya takes it up, is something that we can translate as person. And again, person is the relation between Purusha and person has an Indo-European resonance. They are very similar. So Purusha dividing himself into four is a very early structure. In the early hymns, we have the sun that emanates four forms of itself that are called the four kings. And here we have Purusha that divides itself into four. We'll see how this origin hymn develops as we go to the Veda. In the Veda, in the 10th mandala of the Veda, we find another origin myth. And we find that the language of that origin myth is also very different from other myths of the Veda, or other hymns of the Veda, or other hymns of the 10th mandala itself. And that particular hymn is called the Na Sadhya Sukta. Na Asad means does not exist. Na Sadhya Sukta. And we'll see that the language of the Na Sadhya Sukta is a new language because it is a transition again from the mythos to the logos. We can see that how within the Veda itself this transition is taking place. To look at the hymn of the Nasadya Sukta without knowing that it is from the Veda, one might think that it is an Upanishad. It's almost exactly like the kind of language we find in the Upanishads. So we will look at this particular origin myth, which is related to the myth of the Purusha Sukta, but states the idea in another way, emphasizing other aspects of origin. Moving to the Upanishad, we find that there is a very important early Upanishad called the Aitareya Upanishad, which gives us an origin myth, which we will consider. This origin myth, interestingly, also uses the term Purusha. If the Purusha Sukta of the 10th mandala of the Veda is the first appearance of the word Purusha, the origin myth of the Aitareya Upanishad is the second occurrence of this same term. So we find that this occurrence has got a certain kind of, early valence to it. The meaning of Purusha modifies as we go further in time. So these early uses of Purusha have the sense of person. And person is not just an anthropic person, but a pre-anthropic person, and something that we can think of as a post-anthropic person, and something that sets up a journey of the anthropos. So we can look at these origin myths, and finally we'll move to the Purana, where we'll see that there is a very different kind of telling of origin myths in terms of persons. These persons are the gods, the primary gods. So it is a return to the mythos, but a different kind of mythos that is with us to this day as the common understanding of modern Hinduism. This will be our journey through the origin myths of early Indian wisdom.